Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, as the end of the session nears, hundreds of bills are still on the table. What policies will legislators tackle? How will social issues be prioritized? And the federal court settles a contentious local issue. Lawmakers continue to debate the state's spending priorities. What areas could see a boost? Which ones will get cut? How will tax reform affect the budget? And how are Utah businesses reacting? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Brian King, Utah's House Minority Leader, Taylor Stevens, political reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune, and Greg Hughes, former Utah Speaker of the House. So glad to have you all with us as we get ready for the last couple days of the legislative session, and there is a lot to get into. Representative King, I want to start with you about a big topic that has been occupying a lot of time, but maybe not any more time for this session: tax reform. We've all been waiting for it. We got a couple drafts of it, but just yesterday, your colleagues and you, let's talk about it, decide we'll put the pause on this tax reform bill. Why?
Well, I think it was a good idea to put the pause on the tax reform bill. This is a problem that we need to deal with, and I give credit to the governor and to the speaker and the president for their willingness to take it on, but it's a complex issue. What we've got here is a dwindling sales tax base. 40 years ago, 70% of our economic activity in the purchase of goods was subject to sales tax. Now it's down to under 40%. So you're seeing that with the movement of our economy to services, legal services, medical services, things like that, those are all not taxed. And so what you're seeing is a smaller and smaller base of economic activity to gain revenue from. We've still got income tax, of course, and property tax, but our sales tax base has created some real problems.
Taylor, I want to get into what happened on this pause, too. I know you were on the Hill a lot. This was a solid lineup of people trying to impact this legislation. I mean, you saw industries that don't come on the Hill up there fighting about it. Talk about who you're seeing and what their big arguments were.
Yeah, so as Brian mentioned, this would kind of shift to some service-based taxes, and so it would increase to these businesses that are kind of outside of the tax umbrella. So ride-sharing services, haircuts, personal trainers, you've got all of these businesses that would be taxed. And so you had, they don't want to have those taxes. In some cases, it can be difficult when you're dealing specifically with cash to have those taxes. So you have these industries really coming to Capitol Hill and lobbying to try and get rid of these taxes, or at least to slow this process down. This bill was introduced last week, and they want more time for interim study, and I think more time to make their case to lawmakers that these are services that shouldn't be taxed, each individual kind of business.
So, Speaker Hughes, so you had to grapple with this while you're in the House. I mean, what problem are we really getting to, and do these people who are having a complaint about that have a point?
So one of the things I've learned, I'm former Speaker, first time in 16 years that I've not been part of that legislative session, and I can tell you, after being there for so long, when you have the volume of emails and you have the media interviews and you start to believe that there's a political hub of the universe that the Capitol and its general session is, and that the public has some understanding or some deeper acknowledgement that that's happening. What I've learned being outside, not being part of the general session, is that in the busy lives of Utahns, the legislative session and its work is not as deeply understood. And so
wait, what?
I know. This is going to be hard, Brian. I'm going to let you down softly. So you've heard terms like record surplus. You've heard terms like tax cuts. And then you hear we have a structural imbalance and we have to restructure because we're not getting enough to fund government. And these are very confusing messages that the public are hearing, if they hear them, in terms of everything that's going on. So you have an income tax uniquely in Utah that is dedicated to education. That's public schools, K through 12, as well as your higher institutions of higher learning. But outside of that income tax, your state property tax, your state sales tax, those are wholly dedicated to everything else. And as Representative King just pointed out, if your sales tax is shrinking, how does a growing state pay for transportation, water, public safety, health and human services, there is a reckoning coming. And I think it is absolutely necessary to look at this, but I think there has to be that broader conversation or understanding what the problem is and then how we address it. And I think that in a short and abbreviated session was it was a big challenge.
Talk about this, Representative King, because you talk about this imbalance in some of these shrinking areas. So what was the wisdom or the thinking of, we have these dwindling things, but maybe we'll cut them even more? We fix this by cutting.
Well, if you expand the sales, it's broaden the base, lower the rate idea. If you expand the sales tax rate enough, it brings in enough extra money that you can lower the rate and still be revenue neutral, or, and this was designed to be revenue neutral as opposed to a tax hike. The problem is that when you broaden the base and expose people who've never had to pay sales tax before to a tax for the first time, tell them it's a sales tax decrease. They're going to look at you and say, I've never been taxed before. This is a tax increase to me. So it's difficult to explain that. It's difficult to help people understand that. And that's the problem that we had in the session, as Speaker Hughes was saying. We just didn't have an opportunity to really educate people in the way that we needed to.
There's also a proposed reduction in the income tax, which was, and what that is look, you have this is a red state. You have Republican legislators. Creating new taxes is not really in the wheelhouse of Republicans, okay? That's not what Republicans typically do. It was important, if you were going to have to see a restructuring of this tax system, to really do what the tax system did 20 years ago in terms of getting a revenue from what people's expendable household income was spent on. You didn't want it to overburden or even burden the taxpayer. You wanted to see that tax relief at the same time. That's how a red state would at least attempt it. I give full credit to my colleagues who, instead of doing nothing, which in politics it's much easier to kick the can down the road and avoid these crossroads of these problems, they tackled it. They tackled it in a way that I think was genuine. I think it's good tax policy. I just think that, again, not knowing what the issue was necessarily and how that was going to actually improve the prospects for everyone, it was a very, very difficult lift.
I was just going to say that idea of cutting the income tax was controversial in this sense. As the Speaker said, all state income tax is dedicated for K through 12 and higher ed. So when you cut the income tax, you're basically cutting dollar for dollar money out of a fund that is dedicated specifically for our public and higher education. That was a problem.
Well, Speaker Wilson, the current Speaker of the House, said we have a public education funding issue to resolve. Does this do that? At least the draft that we've seen so far?
It does it in a roundabout way. The problem is that it's hard to understand how we solve or make progress on a public education funding problem by cutting the funds that are specifically allocated for public and higher ed.
Well, and it's worth noting that lawmakers have been taking from income tax to fund other programs already. And so this isn't a sustainable model right now as it is for education.
Taylor just brought up a critical point in why I think that this reform would buttress the funding for public education, and that is prior to the constitutional amendment in 1996 that allowed state institutions of higher learning to use the state income tax, those schools were funded wholly by general fund, so the property tax and sales tax. Over the years since that 1996 constitutional amendment, more of the income tax has gone into our institutions of higher learning, and that general fund has been shifted to other priorities. The argument and the logic was, if you could generate more general fund revenue, you could begin to put that general fund back into higher ed, which is where it used to go, and that you wouldn't see the income tax necessarily used for higher ed, which would, again, buttress the education budget. You had Terry Shoemaker from the Association of Superintendents. You had other education leaders that supported this reform. I think it was hard to digest for many. The teachers union was opposed to it because you are talking about the income tax going lower, and as Representative King just pointed out, on its face, that might look like it's less money. But I think that recommitting general funds to higher ed so that you could have more money available for our public schools was a genuine priority, and I think in the long run, if we see a shift like this, ultimately, it will buttress our education budgets.
Okay, before we leave this entirely, Taylor, we're not done with this issue, right? So what has the legislature decided to do?
So they've moved this issue to interim study, and the governor has said that there probably will be a special session by this summer. So the legislative session, as we know, ends next week. There will be study in the meantime, and the legislature will reconvene to try and make this giant overhaul Hall at a later time. So this definitely isn't over for this year.
Okay, I guess we'll see it this summer. I guess the question, Speaker Hughes, since you were part of this process, the legislature can call themselves into special session, or will the governor do this one?
We were careful about that constitutional amendment. It would have to be an emergency, and so I don't know that this would rise to that level. You want to be careful that the legislature doesn't get itself into session too often and for too long of a period, or you start looking full time. So I don't think you'll see the legislature call itself in this
Had to ask that.
But I like the arrow in the quiver. I do. I think it's a good one.
Representative King, I want to talk about something that just kind of happened over the last couple of days, the conversion therapy bill.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a moment. We've addressed it on the show a little bit, but big changes in that, which makes the sponsor, Representative Hall, decide that he's not even going to support his own bill. What happened with that? And let's talk about what's happened since.
Well, it came before the Judiciary Committee, and I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee in the House. And there were the idea here is that you've got a consensus within the professional community of the American Psychological and the American Psychiatric Association and therapists saying conversion therapy is a bad idea particularly for minors.
Explain what that is, by the way.
Well, it's the idea that you can either through words, what we call talk therapy, or through more obviously problematic methods, basically convert an individual who is feeling same-sex attraction to being straight. You can convert someone from being gay or lesbian to being straight. Very controversial. And over the years, it's the professionals who are best equipped to deal with this and understand it and recognize whether it's a good or a bad thing have said, no. Conversion therapy is a bad idea. Whether it's hooking somebody up to an electroshock machine, or whether it's even talk therapy in terms of saying to a young person particularly, you need to change your sexual orientation because there's something wrong. It leads to suicide, leads to depression, leads to anxiety, leads to despair, all sorts of problems. And that's a well-formed consensus. So the bill that Representative Hall was bringing was to say, we're going to eliminate the ability for licensed clinicians and practitioners, professionals in the state of Utah, to provide conversion therapy to kids, to minors. It only applied to minors. And I supported that bill. Representative Hall worked very hard on it. He got a lot of stakeholders to the table. The LDS Church signed off on language that was in Representative Hall's bill in terms of saying we're okay with this. And we came to committee and it all fell apart.
Let's talk about the fall apart. Taylor, as you were watching this, the people who are trying to change were saying, hey, this is a freedom of speech issue. This is parents deciding what's best for their children kind of issue. Discuss how that played into this discussion.
Yeah, and I think just going back a little bit, as Brian mentioned, this was negotiated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so it had some momentum going into the session, and I think that there was a sense that this was going to be the year that there would be some movement on this. If not full passage, at least it would, kind of make its way through the legislature. And I think maybe there was a little bit less focus on engaging particular lawmakers to kind of talk to them about the particulars of the bill and what it would do. And so I think that it was a surprise to the bill's sponsor. A lot of therapists came out, some said that they were comfortable with the language of the bill, but others felt like the language in the bill was overly broad and would kind of stifle legitimate forms of therapy. And so with that, you saw the bill pretty much get gutted to the point where, as you've noted, Representative Hall felt that he couldn't support the language in it and that it would effectively not end conversion therapy. Speaker
Hughes, let's take that insight. Even Troy Williams, who runs Equality Utah, who was on the suicide task force, which is something that Representative King was talking about. There's a tie between suicide and this issue. Even he resigns. We have a sit-in outside the governor's office. Explain the ramifications there and why people are taking the stand they are.
People are justifiably, and I mean justifiably, upset by this. There's a legislative process, and when you bring stakeholders together, as this bill sponsor did, and you hear the governor and the executive branch express its support, and other critical stakeholders that do, it is not okay. Committees have to have that debate, that robust debate. The public there's a portion that the public gets to speak, and you're always able to consider new information. But I find it disingenuous for anyone, for that committee to sub that bill, for it to be seen, the substitute being so bad, the bill sponsor won't push it forward, but then everyone to kind of wash their hands and say, well, wasn't that sad? And talk post-mortem as if this session's not still going on, as if a bill doesn't die and come back and be reconsidered by a committee. There is still time. even in this short session. And I just keep reading obituary after obituary from people who said they supported it. And you could be working on this right now. And they're not. And so I just find some pageantry going on right now, and I think it comes at the expense of some of these kids. And it just bothers me.
Representative, can I read something to you as you give a comment to this? Because we saw something interesting happen that you don't often with elected officials. Governor Herbert was taking a couple shots because of his support of this substitute bill that came out.
Originally, he supported Representative Hall's original bill, and then he changed horses and supported the substitute.
So there's a sit-in outside, to your point there, from people who are upset about the changes to this bill, demanding an apology for the governor. And what's interesting is they got it. I want to show just a little bit of this letter that they got from the governor last night and get your reaction to it. Just want to read a little piece of it. The governor said, "I realize there is much I do not understand about the issues that LGBTQ youth face every day. I also believe that you deserve to be heard. You deserve our help. And you deserve a future where you can feel safe, welcome, and loved in our state. My intention in supporting the forced substitute was never to harm you. We have had an enormous misunderstanding, and I am sorry."
I think that was remarkable. And for him to acknowledge, I think what was remarkable is, what was remarkable is that he switched horses in midstream, and then within a day or two comes back and says, "I was wrong. I was basically misled may not be the right word, but I was basically under the wrong impression when I supported that substitute, and now I'm sorry that I did that." And I agree actually with Speaker Hughes. We've still got some days, I know it's frightening, we've still got some days in the session that I can't speak for Representative Hall, of course, but I think there has been a consensus developed that that substitute that we ended up passing out of the committee was not the best policy.
Well, letters of apology, I mean, I think it's a move you haven't seen before. But again, it's as if that's past tense. It's as if this is over. We're sorry. Better luck next time. There's a session going on right now. People need to really back up what they believe. People need to do what they're saying they believe. If you say you support something, you should be doing it right now. You're on the clock. These sessions are incredibly brief, and we have the shortest session in America, 6.5 weeks, general session. It's still going on, and you hear people talking like this is all over. It's just disappointing.
I think that's the subtext to this conversation, is that the governor and the lieutenant governor have said that they're supportive of efforts to decrease Utah's youth LGBT suicide rates, and that they felt that the governor's support for this substitute bill was kind of antithesis to that statement, and that they didn't want to be window dressing for a cause that, wasn't actually moving forward.
Very good. I want to get to another piece of legislation that was dropped, but mostly as it relates to the United States Constitution and also how we elect officials in our state. So first, let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. We got this resolution back, all right? We're one of the states that has said we would like to be part of a Constitutional Convention if this ever happens. Right? Constitutional Convention. Of course, we have not had one of these since the original Constitutional Convention. Why is this an issue for the state? Why are some, particularly Republicans, saying we want in?
Well, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution allows the states to get together, and if they aggregate a certain number who want to call a constitutional convention, they can do it. As you say, it's never been done before, but there has been talk around the country, mostly on the right side of the political spectrum, to say our government, federal government, is out of control with regard to spending, with regard to people staying in office in Congress too long, and so some states, Utah being one of them, have now entertained over the years these petitions, resolutions to call a constitutional convention to deal with those issues. We've dealt with this in years past. We've never passed it in both bodies and had it sent to the governor. This year it passed the Senate and it passed the House. We had that debate earlier this week, and I have some concerns about it simply because I don't think that the best way to hold your elected officials accountable is to vote them out of office if they're not doing what you want. And that's something that a con doesn't replace good policy on that matter.
Well, that's interesting. Go ahead, Speaker, because Article 5, you need 38 states to say they want to do this, and even then, right?
Well, our founders contemplated this, that the states are the boss. They are the sovereign authority. The federal government is what they bind together for. They contemplated it. Why in the world would we not trust states to come together? Our Constitution, our state Constitution, sees amendments. We look at that Constitution, we bring it to the people. You see that happen. I don't know if what we see happening in the trajectory of Congress and the inability to pass a budget and to just do supplementals over and over, 6 months, a year, we're not seeing what I think we should expect out of our federal government in terms of work. I don't think it matches or remotely resembles the legislative work that you see on a state level. So why wouldn't those states come together and look at a process that I believe in Washington, D.C. is truly broken, and amend the Constitution to repair what has clearly gotten out of control? I trust states. I think states can come together in that convention. If you make that decision to not have a constitutional convention merely because we've never had one before and we're afraid of what that would result in, that's a decision born out of fear, and I don't think decisions born out of fear are your best decisions that you'd make.
Okay, I want to keep on this thread with maybe the states being left to do something. Taylor, the United States Supreme Court has said, the Senate Bill 54, if you decide you want to have 2 ways to get on the ballot as a state, go for it. What does that mean that the United States Supreme Court decided not to hear the case, letting the decision stand? We have 2 ways to the ballot in Utah.
It means that this fight's going to go to the legislature next. They have said that they're not going to consider whether, they're not going to consider this, that they believe it should stand, that you can either do the signature gathering process or the caucus convention, more traditional model. But it doesn't mean the fight is over. It just means that those who are kind of behind this movement are going to direct their efforts elsewhere, I think.
Are we done with this? So Representative King, your own paper, I'm going to say, Taylor, I think the phrase is, the war is over, the voters have won. Is it over?
I think some wind has been taken out of the sails of people who want to go back to the caucus system. However, what people need to know is this has come before us just about every session in the last 5 years or 6 years. I mean, Speaker Hughes dealt with it regularly. And the reason that we have an alternative route to the primary ballot right now is because Democrats have hung together as a solid group and said, we support SB 54. When it was originally passed, it had significant majorities from both the Republican and the Democratic caucuses. But since then, it's been under attack regularly. I think that we will continue to see that alternative route to the ballot in SB 54 maintained in place, but it'll be under attack again.
Well, Speaker Hughes, you're in the middle of this as we're going forward. Is the Republican Party, particularly the Central Committee of the party, are they going to let it go? Or are you going to see our legislators feel pressure every session to address it?
I think, look, it's hard when any political party feels their nominating process has been brought upon them from an effort outside of their very party or their structure. So there was just immediate pushback, which I almost think is a human instinct. If you're having ballots and ballot measures and the legislature decide how your party's going to nominate its nominees for the ballot in November. So I would like to see that simmer down. I'd like to, all of our political parties need to be parties and work together and not fight within. And so I think it's healthy if that doesn't happen. I will tell you that I regret. I know that I supported Senate Bill 54 when it was the compromise because I feared that we were walking into the elimination of a caucus convention cycle. And just like this program, the more you're able to talk and dive into issues versus direct mail and media buys, and those bullet points are great in a busy world. But I do think substance matters. And when all roads for all candidates led through the caucus convention cycle, it drove all candidates to try and encourage as many people as they could to attend those caucuses. And while some people felt that they were still maybe too strident, I thought that the best medicine, and I still believe, would be robust participation. You're not going to get that now. As long as you can get on the ballot now through signatures, there isn't going to be that encouragement to attend those caucuses. And I think that within the Democrat Party, you'll see a more strident Democrat delegate as well as a more strident Republican. And I don't know that that's the fix either.
Okay, that's got to be the last word on that one. But we're watching these close. None of these things are over. Thank you so much for talking to us today and for your insights. Well, that's it for the Hinckley Report. You may not know this, but your generous support makes programs like the Hinckley Report possible. Please take a moment to make a donation in support of the programs that you rely on. I'm Jason Perry. Thank you and good night.